Okay, welcome back to the channel, everyone. We are extremely excited to bring you a very special guest today, Emmanuelle Maitre. Thank you for being here so much.
It's my pleasure.
So Emmanuel is a very prestigious expert on this topic, has written a million different articles specifically about where France stands in terms of its nuclear posture, nuclear doctrine, nuclear deterrence in Europe. Has worked with many different institutions, including the Brookings Institution, and has a long list of different accolades. So we are extremely excited to present her today and ask some questions about our debate topic for PF. So before we start, I'll just read out the wording of the topic one more time. So the wording of the topic that we are likely to debate is the EU should establish a nuclear sharing agreement, create an independent deterrent capability. So we have questions for you about the context behind the topic, everything that's happening right now. We have questions about what the topic would realistically look like, and we have questions about the likely outcomes of this policy if it were to occur. So maybe we can start with some of the questions about the current situation in France and Europe more broadly, if that's good with you. So I guess, is there any like overview, very surface level summary of what's happening in Europe that's relevant to the topic you can give us before we dive into specifics?
Sure. So maybe to go a step back and look at how things have been understood in Europe for basically the last 60 years. So most countries of Europe are part of NATO, and they've been demanding, as the Cold War started, a guarantee that their security would be taken into account, and especially that the US, which was the main power within NATO, would be able to not only protect them against a conventional attack by the Soviet Union, but also against a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. And so they started to form what we called extended deterrence mechanism, where the United States was committed to come to the rescue and try to deter a nuclear aggression, including by positioning some of its nuclear weapons on the European continent. This part of the nuclear sharing agreement and the nuclear mission of NATO is still extremely relevant today, and there's no question about it, really. At the same time, two of European countries have decided to have their own nuclear deterrent for various reasons. One, the UK, working very closely with NATO. One, France, being a little bit more autonomous, wanting to have a little bit more control on its nuclear deterrent, still, of course, a member of NATO, but being a little bit apart and not wanting to link as much its nuclear deterrent to NATO policy. So this is still working. There's no question about it, but I would say there are a number of factors that mean that the conversation is changing a little bit. The most important I will start with is the threat. The level of threat, of course, was high during the Cold War, and there was discussion all over about to what extent American commitment could be seen as credible. It was a bit less high after the Cold War. Soviet Union disappeared, and so there was less fear of a nuclear aggression from Russia. It is starting to rise again after we realized that Russia was indeed conducting a more aggressive policy after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And I would say that at this stage, all NATO countries, of course, after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, are fully aware that Russia is pursuing what we call revisionist goals. They want to change the borders in Europe. They are clearly looking to or hoping to I would say threatening basically the sovereignty of many European states, especially those right on the borders, the Balts, and so on and so forth. So there's clearly a threat, and it creates anxiety in European countries. At the same time, there are some questionings regarding the transatlantic link. This has started not so much as a political issue, but more as a just realistic observation that America is committed to the security of Europe, but it also has many challenges on the other side. And in the Pacific, with the rise of China, which is forcing the US administration to commit more resources to the Pacific, to this balance in the West, I guess, from the US perspective. And so as early as the Obama administration, which was very friendly, I would say, with NATO countries, and there was no political issues here, but there was still a perception that Europe should do more for its own security and expect the US to be a little bit less present. Now, of course, with the election of Donald Trump, the first one, this realization became more acute, and there's been the idea that maybe it would not be just a fact of strategic interest, but also a political thing that Donald Trump administration would be less committed or less credible as the ultimate country that would reassure Europe against an aggression by Russia or other countries. So the idea of the talk about trying to see what alternative could exist started to be more present. We started to hear it more, a little bit reassured with the Biden administration, very close to NATO. But of course, the re-election of Trump in last year has led to a renewal of the debate. So I would say threat going up and confidence in US protection going down creates a favorable favorable context for thinking a little bit out of the box here.
So could you speak a little bit more about what kind of the blocks in the European Union look like in terms of like what that response looks like? Like I would assume it's not a monolith, right? So like what countries are kind of pro nuclear expansion and which ones are kind of against it?
So the first problem is that when we speak about Europe, we speak actually of nothing very concrete. We can speak about NATO European countries. That's a big chunk of Europe. And we can speak about the European Union, which is another big chunk, but they don't match completely. Of course, the UK is a big part of NATO or Norway, but they're not in the EU. On the reverse, some countries like Austria or Ireland are part of the EU, but are not part of NATO. What I was speaking before, the debate and so on, it's not really related to an institution. It's more related to some key European countries having this position at the national level, and then, of course, trying to promote it within various institutions. What is clear is that we've had some different views. Indeed, first of all, there are countries that are extremely tensed and extremely scared about the Russian threats. These tend to be the countries in the east and in the north of Europe, Poland being a major example of a country that really is calling for a reinforcement of security arrangements to counter the Russian threat. Then you would have also countries that would not maybe see eye to eye on to what extent the transatlantic link is indeed weakening. Here, you could say that France has been one of the first and the most vocal in saying that maybe this link remains valid, and there's no saying that it's over yet, but just saying that we could not rely on the Americans as much in the future, not just as I was saying for political reasons, but just because it made sense that Europe had to take more of its own security they had to take care of it more, whereas some countries have been extremely reluctant to question the presence of Americans in Europe. They are extremely attached to this transatlantic link. We could say, for instance, Germany, the countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, even countries in the East as well, like Poland, traditionally extremely close to the US and really willing to do anything that could make sure that the US, whatever the administration, would remain extremely committed. This we've seen has changed also in some unexpected manner. For instance, Denmark, which was one of the strongest voice speaking about the transatlantic link in the past, has been quite shocked by the Trump administration behavior over Greenland. So the lines are moving a little bit. Lastly, I think it's important to note that when we speak about, I was saying the institutions at the beginning, of course, NATO, very important, but it's a little bit difficult to, within that institution, to really have this type of debate. Of course, the US is present, so it's hard to question their participation while they are still very much involved in NATO at this stage. But there are also other countries present, such as, for instance, Turkey or Hungary, which have different views on security and with which there's not the same level of confidence probably than others. regarding the EU now, that's quite another issue because here in the EU, of course, there are things that are being done at the security level, but regarding nuclear deterrence, especially some countries are opposed to it. They have signed a treaty, which is the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, and therefore they do not want to engage any conversation where nuclear deterrence would be seen as a solution for security problems. These countries are especially Austria, Ireland, but there are also others which are supportive of this approach.
Okay, so
That makes sense.
yeah, do you think there's any countries that have both the political and like technological desire to proliferate on their own, or do you think it's more of like an institutional conversation?
So I think at the institutional level, and especially for the EU, it's absolutely out of the picture right now. There's neither the means or the hope or the ambition from any side to do it. It's never been talked about, and it's completely out of the picture. If we look at individual countries, we've seen some discussion, which is quite unbelievable to be honest. 10 years ago, it was impossible to imagine that you would read actually not only German, but also Swedish, for instance, commentators, it's experts or people, editors in the press, wondering aloud about this option. It's quite incredible. It's really not reflecting the views of any government at this time. That's quite clear. I think it's reflecting more of a fear or spirit or a kind of context once again. We see it in countries that were traditionally quite hostile to nuclear deterrence and were pushing for disarmament. I was mentioning Sweden, Germany, for instance. Once again, it's really not representative at this stage. It's a very low debate, but still quite interesting because so new and so contrary to what anything we knew about those countries or how the way they were seeing the international security. In some other countries like Poland that I mentioned already quite a lot, here again, it's not reflecting the views of the government. They've never spoken in favor of it at this stage, but we can imagine that they are a little bit less constrained in imagine what they could have to do if they felt that they had a security imperative to do it. So experts in Poland are a little bit less, I would say, have less problem imagining it. The problem here is more in terms of technical means and just it's still very realistic at this stage that any country would decide to go alone and start to launch a military program from scratch. But it's an interesting change, as I was mentioning.
So that's
So
really interesting to me because we tend to see that a lot in America, with just like sensationalist headlines tend to be the things that end up sparking those debates. So it sounds like what you're saying is it's less like actual policy proposals and a little more just like these are the things that kind of rise to the top of the discussion because they're interesting, they're different. That's interesting. Sorry, Mac, what were you going to say?
I was just going to ask, like, I know that the Prime Minister of Poland, for example, has remarked on several occasions that they might kind of be interested in establishing their own nuclear arsenal. He said, for instance, that if Ukraine had kept its nukes, maybe it would be safe from Russia. So I was wondering if that is empty rhetoric or what purpose that serves politically, if it's not like a true sign that they might be pursuing an arsenal.
Honestly, it's hard to say because I know very good Polish experts and colleagues who were a little bit confused about the speech itself, and we know that sometimes political leaders make declarations and then we are a little bit at loss to know exactly what was intended. That being said, I think it's very clear when you travel in Poland, in the Baltic countries, there is a panic over Russia. And so whatever brings a little bit of security cannot be rejected at all like this. I mean, they cannot say we'll never do it just because they have to imagine anything to just be safe from a Russian invasion, which is really at the center and everywhere in the security thinking, and for unfortunately good reasons. So that's one thing. The second, of course, is that we know that Poland is very close to the US, usually in NATO, a very good ally, and always willing to do what it takes. It's been the first one to really raise its military budget within NATO. So there's probably not a lot of chances that it would be willing to abandon completely this status of a good ally, credible, with a strong integration with the other partners around, with the US, to try this kind of adventurous program. But then I think, yeah, it was also probably political signaling within Poland to say we're going to do what it takes. Maybe also with the other NATO member state to say, yeah, be careful. We understand that the US has other things to do and needs to be in Asia and everything, but we really want reassurance and we want the US to commit, as probably the Biden administration did repeatedly, explaining that it would honor its commitment. So there's clearly a demand for this type of reassurance.
That makes
So,
sense. And
yeah,
yeah, just
go.
one moment. So you said that people in Poland and Eastern Europe in general are scared of Russia for good reason. I was wondering how your perception of like the actual threat that Russia poses is, and what motivations Russia might have to attack Poland, for example, in like the next 5 years.
So I think what they are always referring to is to begin with the history of being constantly under attack by Russia, constantly dominated, and invaded at the uh, any occasion that Russian fell. So there's, I would say, a historical trauma that there's
Mhm.
always going to be a threat from the east, in that no border is ever going to be secure because Russia is always willing to expand its borders. So that's, I guess, the historical perspective. Now, if we look at the Baltic countries, we know that they have the specific situation, especially some of them, like Latvia, are having a very strong Russian population within their within the nation. This Russian minority is not very well integrated to the country, does not speak the language, and may feel a little bit marginalized. And we know that Putin has used that as an excuse to invade and to conquer a great part of Ukraine, and has mentioned that he felt responsible for the welfare of all the Russian people as ethnic Russian, and not as citizen Russians. And so he might be tempted to use that as a pretext to conquer lands that he's never really accepted were not his. I mean, of course, Lithuania has been a country in the Middle Age and so on, but Latvia, Estonia, they've been part of the Russian Empire, they've been part of the Soviet Empire. And so we know that the Russian leadership has never really accepted 1991 and the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. So there's clearly a willingness to take revenge on what happened in 1991 and to go back to this greater Russia. So I think that's really the fear, and the Ukraine war and the invasion in 2022 has shown that Russia was ready to take great risks, even risk confrontation with NATO, to push for these strategic goals.
That's very interesting. So I want to go back a little bit to the Poland discussion. It sounded almost like the US has like this kind of contradictory desire, where on the one hand, Donald Trump is saying you need to increase your investment, you need to build your own independent capabilities. And then on the other hand, it seemed like you were indicating that the US wouldn't like it if Poland were like, violating the NPT, actively pursuing nuclear weapons. So from, your perception, how would the US react to a country like Poland pursuing its own kind of nuclear weapons?
So in a predictable world, if it happened, for instance, now, the immediate reaction would be legal. The US would have to sanction Poland, would have to cut any cooperation, would have to cut military cooperation, aid cooperation, whatever cooperation, because of existing law within the US that prevent the US government from working with a country that is basically proliferating nuclear weapons. So it would immediately apply, and it would be extremely hard to waive those sanctions and to not start doing what has been done for other countries, for instance, India and Pakistan back in the days. It is very hard to imagine that the US government would not see it as extremely negative for its own security. Ever since the Cold War, the US has felt that it needed to keep the control on nuclear weapons to try to to prevent its allies from getting them. And even, I mean, France and the UK, it was done, accepted eventually, but really they would have preferred not to. At the time, for a number of reasons, of course, from exclusivity comes a little bit of power, probably, and the ability to influence, but also, and maybe more importantly, in the long run, there's this idea which I think is really sustaining the whole non-proliferation world, which is nuclear deterrence. Maybe it works, maybe in the Cold War, because the US had nuclear weapons, Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, we managed a type of stability, and there was no incentive to attack any of them because they knew that an attack would lead to the destruction of their own country. So it created a little bit of stability, and there was also this idea, which maybe now looks a little bit more, maybe it has been exaggerated, but still, that at the end of the day, US leaders, American leaders, they knew how they worked a little bit. They knew how they functioned psychologically, and they were ready to take some risks, but they were also ready to back down to avoid this global nuclear war. If more countries join the club, get their own nuclear weapons, there's always been this thinking that it could really start to put a little grain of sand in that machinery, and that it could create instability, because then maybe the leader of this country could take risks and get the US involved into a conflict that it did not want and escalate to nuclear use, where the US was just not ready to have this escalation. So, as I was saying, the US eventually accepted the status of France, and the UK, they have said that it actually contributes to increase nuclear deterrence, to have this separate center of decisions. But there was a little bit of fear at some point that allies with nuclear weapons could be unreliable and could basically drag the US into a nuclear conflict where it was really not in the interest of the country, I guess, for any nuclear weapon, and especially a country, a nuclear power like the US, which has so many interests, which is involved and committed to extended deterrence. It wants to control when it gets to nuclear war. And during the Cold War, that was central, that it would not be forced into nuclear war by the stupid action or just something that another country had done. So I think this is still something important. The non-proliferation regime is still seen as important to prevent that, and to prevent the cascading effect of this country gets them and that country gets them and then another one, and there is a chain reaction which is basically uncontrollable. So that's the mindset that has prevailed so far. It's true that Donald Trump has said contradictory things on that. He said not on Poland especially, but on South Korea, more to the point. He seemed to allude to the fact that if South Korea had their own nuclear weapon, it could allow the US to be less present on the peninsula and to withdraw some troops and make savings along the way. But I don't believe at this stage that we have any clue that it is actually the US policy, even under this administration. They've not said anything else that these random comments to let us assume that the US would actually view favorably the proliferation of one of its allies.
That is the problem in American politics right now, is discerning what is policy and what is random comment. Yeah, that's very interesting. Mac, do you have any questions about that, or do we want to move on to Suez
Uh,
and
I've got one last question about the context in Europe. So, I know that very recently, actually, like sort of right now, Macron is in the UK, and the UK and France seem like they're signing a new agreement about nuclear coordination and other defense agreements. This is also coming just a few weeks after the UK had a security partnership with the EU. That's kind of a brand new development. So I was wondering how these developments are changing the modern day situation.
I think they're really in the continuity of what has been done so far, and especially what France has been trying to do, which is to say, well, look, we have a security issue, Russia especially, but not only, but mainly. We have a partnership with the US, super important, very strong, but we must admit that US is going to decline its support to Europe in the long run. So we have to do more for our own security. What have we got to do that? Some countries have troops, some countries have missiles, some countries have navies, whatever. We have nuclear weapons. They can serve, but more globally, the European security. And by the way, the UK as well. The UK is not in the EU, but it really doesn't matter because at this stage, we're just thinking, as I was trying to say earlier, the continent, let's say. And if there is a threat against France, there's a threat against the UK and vice versa. This is something that was already said 30 years ago, I think. Where the two countries agreed that if the vital interests of one country are being threatened, it's the vital interests of the others are as well, which I think is a very good way to start with thinking about it, because when we speak about nuclear extended deterrence and nuclear weapons and how they contribute to security, we have to imagine a situation which is already extremely bad. It's not just a few troops across the borders. It's not just a couple of missiles that have been thrown. It's really a situation which is so bad that we are actually contemplating the use of nuclear weapons. So for a country like France, like the UK, there's no scenario of limited use or just using a couple of nuclear weapons to try to destroy a target, or it does not exist. If we use them, it's because we have nothing else, and that's the end. There's no next step. So obviously, if we get to that, it means that the situation in all of Europe is absolutely disastrous. And so I'm often asked this, especially about European journalists or colleagues, and they kind of wonder about why would France want to defend the interests of Latvia or Greece. Well, if we think about nuclear weapons, we are at a situation where the whole continent is under threat. And obviously we are under threat because the situation is so bad. So I'm always a bit emphasizing it or insisting, because clearly nuclear weapons, you don't use them as soon as there is a couple of troops on across the border. So that was for the fact that obviously UK, France are involved in that together. Now, the two countries, so as I was saying, politically have been committed to that for a long time. They've also been working together on very technical issues to modernize their capacity. They do that completely on their own, but they have capacity infrastructure in France that both can use to make some tests and stuff like that. But the announcements of today, they go a step further, because here we can see the willingness to say we have limited forces, both of us. France has 4 submarines, we have a couple of planes, they have 4 submarines as well, which means basically 1 at a time at sea. Maybe we can do it in a way that we actually do it smart, and we can deter better if we actually coordinate and think about targets together and stuff like this. Doesn't mean that we are going to just organize in a way that we'll wait for the British Prime Minister to tell us what to do. And the reverse is not going to be true as well. But I think it's really a strong step to show the commitment to actually indeed contribute to a better deterrent by trying to work together and be more efficient.
Yeah, that makes sense. One follow-up question on that. Do you think this is like enough? Like, how effective is it likely to be at reassuring allies and deterring Russia, or is much more needed?
So I think, first of all, the two goals are quite different, and the US knows that better than anybody else. Deterring Russia, it's just making sure that Putin understands that if he goes too far, France would react. Reassuring allies is quite another business, much more difficult. And you usually need to do much more to actually convince them that you're serious about it. What we've seen over the years, over the months lately, is that there's skepticism, I guess. Most countries appreciate the willingness of Macron to speak about it, to say, and they see it a little bit as a display of solidarity, which is something that France has not been always accused of. So it's quite nicely received. But the problem is that for many countries, they've been used to think only in the framework of NATO working with the US, which has thousands of nuclear weapons, all types, ground launch, sea launch, plane launch, small ones, big ones, any kind. And it's completely different. The doctrine is different, the capacities are different, the means are different, sorry, from what we can do here in France. So obviously, if you compare, there's no comparison. So we have to explain that according to France, it might work, it might not, but at least the doctrine is that you can deter Russia, which is much bigger, with much more nuclear weapon, with a smaller arsenal. Because as long as you can actually get one or two nuclear weapons across, even if they shoot down a couple of planes, even if they actually kill a submarine or two, there's still one. It's going to launch ballistic missiles. Maybe one or two are going to go through, even if there are defenses across. And if there is actually one or two nuclear weapons that explode on key targets in Russia, that's enough to deter them. We don't need hundreds of weapons. We don't need thousands of weapons. That's enough. Whether or not it's credible, I am not judging myself, but the French authorities have been working on that assumption for a long time, and they're not the only one. I mean, the Chinese, for instance, for a long time also believed they could deter with a smaller arsenal. And therefore, the question when we think about Europe is not so much that we need to have a bigger arsenal because we are speaking about protecting Europe. It doesn't really change anything. We still believe that we need to be able to go through Russia or others. I'm insisting on Russia because it's important, but obviously it's not tailored to Russia. But the idea is if we can make enough destruction, and nuclear weapons, one is already a lot of destruction. So the belief is that if we can convince Russia that they would suffer enough damage, then they will believe that it's not worth it and they will not do it. That's how it works. Now, as I was saying, not everybody is convinced about it in Europe. And so there's clearly a dialogue to try to think about how the French authorities and the French military feel about it, and also what they can do to reassure their partners.
Okay. I have so many more questions, honestly, but we need to get to the nuclear sharing agreement, right? And what it would actually look like. I want to ask about hypersonics, what this modernization is, the plan for, breaking through Russian defenses. But I think more specifically, we're very curious, like what would a realistic implementation of a nuclear sharing agreement look like, right? I think based on everything you've said and everything we've read, it doesn't seem like it's a thing that would actually ever happen, at least not now. But what do you think that France would be willing to commit to on the part of the EU?
So it's quite difficult because what you need to understand is that this issue is quite conservative in France. There's always been the doctrine, and usually at some point in the discussion, people would bring up the General de Gaulle, which was the first president of the Fifth Republic, who kind of was very instrumental at the beginning of the French tyranny, and then that would be the end of the debate. If de Gaulle had said that, then it was that. So we try to be very prudent on what can be done, what cannot be done, what is impossible, and then we see President Macron surprising us and going always a step further than what we expected him to go. So I will try not to say that nothing is possible. I think many things are moving, and it's quite amazing to see. I still believe that some things are quite difficult to imagine, and the first one is to have loss of control of the decision of employing nuclear weapon the sharing of the decision. Sharing of the decision actually never happens or happened. Even in NATO, of course, if they want to use the nuclear weapons that are stationed in Europe, they need to share the decision. But there's this understanding that at the end of the day, there's only one country that really matters in that decision, and that if they want to use nuclear weapons, they're not going to wait for Bulgaria or Hungary to give their opinion, right? So this idea that sharing the decision cannot work. You are in a scenario under attack. Probably the country is half destroyed. President might be dead. I mean, you are actually contemplating nuclear retaliation. You're not going to ask anybody. It has to be done right away. Maybe you have 10 minutes, maybe like, once again, I think that the scenarios that are being thought about are quite critical. And so sharing of the decision doesn't work. And that's the operational situation, but political situation is nobody wants to share the decision. Of course, it's way too sensitive. And so there's always a little bit of confusion on this, but I think it's quite still a no-go of what is not possible. Second, as I mentioned, not the EU at this stage. EU cannot work on nuclear deterrence because of the positions of states. So it has to be something else, it has to be ad hoc. As of now, it looks like it's more bilateral with different countries. So France and Poland, France and Germany, France and Netherlands, and so on, whoever is interested, and trying to figure out how these commitments can be integrating a kind of nuclear extended deterrence, which is not called that way, which is not as clear, as broad, but looks a little bit like it. Lastly, I think this is something we work a lot here on. This is something we work a lot on here, which is capacities. France has made the choice in the 50s, 60s to develop its own capacity, not to buy anything from anybody, and to be able to control from A to Z, from the bolts on the missiles to the actual submarines, to make everything at home. This doesn't change. I don't expect it to change. However, we see more and more willingness to think about how allies can contribute capacities which are not key or critical for the nuclear mission. We could do without, but if we do with it, it's even better. If we use it, if we integrate, if we work together on conventional systems, more planes, refueling, whatever, Navy capacity, Navy ships that can help make the zone more secure, intelligence, plenty of capacities that can be of use. If they're not here, fine, we can still do the mission, but if they're here, it's much more credible. I think this is something that we are spending some time thinking about, and I think it's also what the officials are thinking about.
So do you think that a sharing agreement would go beyond NATO or France's current commitments to NATO, or do you think like structurally, or do you think it would be more of like a symbolic kind of discussion?
I think it could be a little bit beyond. I think that the commitment to NATO is already sometimes forgotten and is quite important, but I think it could go beyond. I feel that the president is actually willing to go beyond.
Interesting. Okay. And so you talked a lot about the reactions in France. So there's an election coming up. The right is down, up sometimes. The center seems very interesting. So what would each of the kind of political spectrums look like in terms of their reaction to something like this?
So we usually say a bit like actually in Washington that this issue is bipartisan. I mean, we don't have bipartisan, but the idea is the same, that there's always been consensus. When we had a president coming from the left in the 80s, at the time, which was quite a shock, left being quite leftist, he had no problem with the nuclear deterrence, and there was a lot of continuity. That being said, in the past few years, the issue has been very politicized by the far right and by the far left. Both of them has agreed on the fact that we should not put in peril the sovereignty of the nuclear force. So obviously, this is also something that is taking away some of the credibility of the offer. And I always joke, if I want to know how the far right is doing in France, I go to Poland and I ask, because they are looking at it very, very seriously, and they are very scared, not just because of this, but because of the relation that the far right had with Russia, where they used to be quite close. Now, obviously, with Trump, we are used to others. I mean, it's kind of good for other countries because everything looks fine in comparison. But still, there was some fear that they would try to improve the relationship with Russia, and that within the EU it would be quite a big deal. The far right is traditionally against NATO because of a kind of populist anti-Americanism that is here. They are traditionally against the EU, which is, I mean, the main reason of the party now. I mean, one of the main elements to criticize the EU and to want to make sure that states remain fully sovereign. So obviously, this means that they've been quite vocal on saying that Macron was trying to sell the nuclear deterrent to Brussels, that he was that what he was doing was unacceptable, and so on. Many other people from the right and even other parties have been also tempted to kind of play this card and to just for political reasons criticize the president by showing that he was irresponsible. But I would expect it to be fine and really in line with what the center right and center left has been working on and proposing for a number of years. So the question remains extreme right, extreme left. Extreme left, I think, is not so much of a probable occurrence right now. They are very confused about everything nuclear, suppose not to like it, but they're proposing to keep the French deterrent, to keep it sovereign, and so on. It's very weird. The far right, obviously, they would not be as proactive as Macron. I'm guessing here. But we've seen in the past European election that they were a bit more cautious about NATO and the EU. They don't want to get out of the EU anymore. They don't want to get out of NATO anymore. And they might be forced to realize that in the context of great threat, France by itself is really not going to be able to defend itself. So there's this idea that if they came to power, they would need to speak out and do stuff. But at the end of the day, they would see our military budget and they would be like, yeah, maybe it's going to be a bit hard. So the idea is also that if we can work, and I was mentioning the bilateral agreements and the more integrated defense with other countries in Europe, they would be forced to realize that we just can't do it otherwise. And that alone we will be so much weaker that it's really silly. Long answer to say, yes, there's clearly a contestation on the far right, on the far left, but they are so confused. It's not a priority issue, and we don't even know what they think, because they don't say. But there's this expectation that the far right, probably on this issue, would have to be a little bit more moderate if they came to power.
That makes sense. So, in the US, our last election was dominated by immigration and egg prices, if we're being honest, right? So I would assume the average American knows literally nothing about American extended deterrence, about, nuclear modernization projects. I guarantee the average American would not know what an ICBM is, right? So what does that look like in France? Like, would the population actually care about something like this in terms of an election? Would it be an issue that was even on their radar?
So I think not, as fully agree with the situation. Immigration would be the big one still. I mean, and for the far right, it's their main idea. However, there is also this anti-European sentiment, which is built a lot on immigration, actually, but also on a type of contestation that in the US you could compare to criticizing the federal state for like going into the life of citizens. And so all the norms that are produced in Brussels and the regulation and so on. And so there's this kind of populist discourse that this is ruining the life of people because they have to comply to, I don't know, they have to buy the car. The car is more expensive because it has to comply to crazy and buy. Okay, I'm not going to make it environmental law that is being
Yeah,
voted in Brussels. You got what I'm trying to say?
yeah. Environmental regulations. Yeah, everyone hates
Thank
them in
you.
America.
Thank you so much. So very few people have any idea about what is actually being done in Brussels, what the regulations are for. They don't realize that most of them are protective, not trying to destroy their way of life, but still it's a populist discourse. And so if by any chance you manage to imply that Macron is actually selling the nuclear deterrent to Brussels, it can have a little bit of resonance. It's absolutely wrong. There's no idea that it might be right. But you could a little bit play on this feeling that anti-European, and of course the EU being the EU Council being the EU Commission, sorry, being led by a German. You can also find a tiny weeny bit of anti-Germanism from way back about against the idea that we are going to give our nuclear weapons to the German and stuff. So by manipulating the truth, you may be able to get people a little bit annoyed about it, which would
And
be
you could probably do
about
that.
something that's not happening.
You could probably do that with where it's at right now, though, right? You wouldn't even need the real policy, I would assume, you know?
Actually, yeah, and it happened last year, which is why I'm mentioning it, because we could read in the paper like we should not give our nuclear weapon to van der Leyen. We're not doing that. But and as experts, we try to write papers and to write pieces to comment on that in the media, but we realize that the media battle is hard to win.
And that was something we noticed when we first started researching the topic because you know the headlines from the speech earlier this year where he was talking about it was like the first and we were like really worried. We were like, wait, is this topic just going to happen before we debate it? And then the more we read about it, we're like, okay, these are just sensationalist headlines. He did not promise to give nukes away. What is going on here? Um, yeah. Mac, did you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, so you were talking about this kind of Eurosceptic populist narrative that exists in France, which also exists in a lot of other EU countries, obviously. So I was wondering, how do you think the rest of the EU might react to a proposal for nuclear sharing with the EU from France?
Uh, I have not seen much about populations. I've seen some Italian populist party that were criticizing it as a way for France to play Napoleon again and to try to, um, but this was, I think, heavily sponsored by Russia. So this type of analysis that wait a minute, France is trying to pretend they're helping you, but actually they just want to impose their grandeur again, and we're back to the time of Louis the 14th. Um, it's not prevalent. I've seen it only a couple of times, and yeah, by some parties that might have been linked to Russia. Um, Otherwise, I think like people have no idea, don't follow it at all. What is sure is that they are more convinced than ever that nuclear deterrence can bring something to their security. They would probably prefer it to be as usual within NATO. As long as it works, it works. And let's not question it. But I've not seen any strong reaction one way or another, and I don't expect it would be. Obviously, they are the two countries that we mentioned earlier, Ireland, Austria. But here again, it's quite funny because I read an interview of a close colleague with an Austrian newspaper. It seemed that the journalist did not know that Austria had signed the treaty against the prohibiting nuclear weapons. I'm not sure he was aware it existed, and it's not a very strong popular sentiment. It's something that the government cares a lot about, but population is basically ignorant about it. So, yeah, I think
That
the
makes
time of big demonstration against nukes is quite over.
Interesting. And then last question I had is earlier you were talking about the French defense budget with regard to this topic. I was wondering if a nuclear sharing agreement happened, do you think the budget would rise? If so, how much? Like, do you think it would involve increasing the French nuclear arsenal and why?
So that's a good question. And actually, we could imagine stuff here. I was saying earlier, to deter Russia, we feel at this stage, and maybe it's going to change tomorrow, but it seemed the president up until now has decided he had enough and that what he had could already deter Russia. But as we were saying, to reassure allies and do stuff, you may need actually to do more than to deter your opponent. So we could think about, and the president has mentioned it, I think a little bit improvising, but still, putting planes in European that can carry nuclear weapons, having them stationed in some countries, thinking of different ways to do that. This would actually cost money because you would need to adapt. If you wanted to deposit nuclear weapons, store them in, I don't know, Belgium, wherever, Poland, you would need to build the infrastructure to get it and so on. So there could be actually cost. And he mentioned in the interview, the president, that these costs would be taken in, would be paid by the host country, a bit like what is happening with NATO, which was very weird because, I mean, nobody had really mentioned it and there was no plan to do it as far as I know. But yes, in that situation, because also it's something we see a lot in Germany, that Germans commentators are convinced that the French actually, the only thing they want is some money to pay for nuclear weapons. What seems to be the way we could talk about the issue as of now, could change, is that for the sovereign nuclear deterrent, France is not interested in taking anybody's money, because if you give money, it means participation in decision making, right? Like taxation and representation. So if we were asking for Germans' money, the German Bundestag would have to vote on it, and we don't want to know if the German Bundestag agrees with the program or not before we do it. So I think this is not possible. However, for other capacities which are not strictly necessary for the nuclear deterrent, but maybe stationing weapons abroad or doing other things, then maybe it could work to have a more balanced way of doing the expenses and to think about it a little bit like what NATO does. The Lithuanian parliament or Italian parliament, they don't decide if whatever you do in Nebraska or in South Dakota, but if the base in Italy, they have a say in whether or not it is modernized or refurbished or stuff like that.
Got it. Thank you.
And then last thing I want to talk about is before we started recording, you started talking about the like linguistic choices in France surrounding these debates, and I find that very, very fascinating. So could you comment a little bit on, what are some of the phrases that are avoided in these kinds of debates?
All of them. It's quite crazy. Extended deterrence, they don't like to use it because what it seems to refer to is the NATO model, and there's no willingness as of now, at least no policy, to do what NATO is doing. Nuclear umbrella, for the same reason. At this stage, once again, if we look at what Macron is saying, he's saying stuff, it has not always trickled down or translated into actual policy. It's not like the US. Usually what he says is going to be a policy at some point. There is a kind of coherence that we don't see necessarily in Washington, but it doesn't go at the same speed. And sometimes he says stuff and it's, as I was saying, a little bit improvised, and he has his counselors saying, yeah, Mr. President, this is maybe possible or not. And also some things are being negotiated, as I was saying, at the bilateral with the Germans, Poles, and so on. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Armed Forces are still quite conservative about wanting to say, we are not trying to replicate NATO nuclear sharing arrangement. We are not willing to be an alternative to that, which is still working, because it's clearly the priority to keep that alive and well as long as we can and not push the Americans out at all. There's absolutely awareness in France that we are not we are not as strong, as great, as whatever. So absolutely keep the Americans in. We're not trying to replace, not trying to push them away, not trying to do the same. Eventually, possibly the word complementarity can be heard, saying we can propose something in complementarity. The first phrasing used to be our vital interests have a European dimension, which really meant just if some European targets are attacked, we are going to be involved because just geography, we're here, and obviously it's going to have an impact. Politics, we're in the EU. If the EU is not working, we have many problems, including regulations and others worse. So that was kind of a factual statement. Our vital interests have a European dimension. President Macron has gone further or has been more ambitious. He has spoken about the way it could contribute to European security, which is really seen as something, as of now, very general, very broad. NATO is a big chunk of it, but member states can also contribute in different manners. I think within NATO, I mean, countries are asked to do stuff and to buy some capacities and to have some interoperability, but they are also able to do whatever they want with the military budget. I mean, they are sovereign nation. So this idea that at the national level, they can all work together and contribute to be also more self-reliant. So contribution to security is a term that we are allowed to use now because the president has said it. What else has he said? We don't use integrated deterrence, for instance, something that is used in the US, not at all in France, not allowed, but the idea is still a little bit there, which is that, of course, nuclear weapons are very special. We can't imagine using them. We don't practice using them in the same way, but they cannot work without some conventional capacities and different capacities. So there's some linkage and some necessary consultation between the two. And here, as I was saying before, maybe it's possible to rely also on European capacities. Yeah, I think that's, but usually I was joking, we don't say much because you will find many statements by, I mean, in non-official setting, but still French officials saying, well, whatever President Macron is proposing, it is not this, it is not that, it is not at all this, we don't intend to do this. And so people are like, so what is it actually? But yeah, always referring to what he has actually said.
Which is funny because as I've learned more about it, I've learned what this nuclear sharing agreement would not include, but I struggle to know exactly what it would include.
Exactly. Yep.
We've reached our hour. Do you have time for one more short question from each of us?
Sure. Yeah. No problem.
Mac, you want to go first? I feel like we might have the
Sure.
same question, to be honest.
Maybe so. We'll see. You've written a ton about non-proliferation in the whole world, agreements like the NPT. I was wondering if France made an agreement to do nuclear sharing with the EU, how would that affect existing international treaties and broader prospects for non-proliferation?
So very good question. And here you can debate for hours about NPT interpretation. According to all the countries in the West, let's say, the NPT does allow for nuclear sharing agreement as long as the host country, which is one of the P5, which is in this situation, France, the UK, and the US, of course, keeps complete control over the weapons. So if you put weapons in Germany, it's fine as long as the German people cannot detonate them ever, which is how it was understood when it was first done before, which was actually before the NPT was signed. And it seems from what I've read, really, that the Soviets agreed to this interpretation. Now, you'll find many articles saying today that this is not right, that the NPT actually prohibits this, and that it is already a violation of the NPT that there are nuclear weapons in 5 countries in Europe, but also in Belarus, possibly by Russia, which has been for many years criticizing it and say it's illegal, but apparently doesn't mind doing it itself. So if we consider that France could do the same, or the UK, but the UK does not have any weapons to station abroad, because at this stage they only have weapons in their submarines. So France could be the only one really concerned if it decided to put some of its little stockpile of airborne weapons abroad. It would not change anything as long, I mean, the situation would be the same as NATO with regard to the NPT, as long as the control remains French. I would, however, for the sake of history, say that it's quite interesting that Germany, which was at the time the FRG, Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and Italy, when they signed the NPT in the 70s, they had a little reservation saying, if one day at the time it was called European Community, I guess, which was the ancestor of the EU, if this transformed into a federation, a true federation, and that the weapons of some of the countries in the federation, I think it was only France, so the UK was already part of the EU. They've been in, they've been out, it's hard to follow, but whatever. If this country has nuclear weapon because one of its founding state is a nuclear weapon state, then it will not violate our NPT commitment. So basically, the idea was if the EU becomes a real state and it kind of recovers the French weapons as part of its new army, European army, it would be compatible with the NPT according to the reservations that Germany and Italy made. To be honest, when I was little, we had this type of debate at school. Could the EU become a federation? I don't think we've really gone into that direction in the last 30 years, but if we want to think big, that could be a scenario in which the question actually arises.
Interesting. Thank you.
I have so many follow-up questions about that, but I'm going to stay focused. So, debaters like interesting and unique arguments. They unfortunately like to run from what we call clash, right? Especially at the higher levels, right? So, what are some unique kind of paths of research that you think students could take on this topic to kind of avoid maybe the escalation, deterrence, Russia debate, or maybe even like the internal politics in France debate? Do you think there's like some like unique area of the world that you would encourage them to research?
I can see two maybe elements we've mentioned a little bit. The first one is that is it even realistic to speak about having this tiny arsenal in comparison with the Russian one or others to actually be able to protect Europe? That could be an argument because we kind of read a lot of material on it, and does the strategy that I mentioned, which is as long as we can get one through, that's enough. Is it actually working? The US for many, many years has believed not. But that's an interesting, I would say, more strategic doctrinal question that could be explored. The other one, I've tried to push it a little bit, and I think it's quite there's a contradiction a little bit that may be interesting to look into. As I was saying, from a French point of view, but especially from the other countries' point of view, the key priority is to keep the situation as it is now. The US strongly involved, strongly present, committed to extended deterrence. At the same time, they've realized that it was a bit silly to just ignore that it could change and that elections happen, stuff happen, and you can find yourself a little bit in trouble if you've not prepared for just something bad happening to you. So how can you do both at the same time? Keep the Americans in and prepare in case they wanted to go out. And you realize it's much more difficult to do than to say, because, for instance, you want to keep the Americans in. What are you going to do? You're going to have political signaling. You're going to buy American stuff. You're going to buy the F-35. You're going to buy American material in different ways. You're going to have more US weapons stationed on your soil. You're going to have maybe more nuclear weapons stationed and so on. But if you do all that, you cannot really prepare for a scenario where the US would be less present, because this scenario would maybe push you to buy other aircrafts that are not controlled by the US. We can imagine that the US has a strong control over F-35, and if they don't sell you the updates for the onboard software, you're not going to fly very high or far or wherever. uh, how can you work and invest in cooperation mechanism with France and the UK if you're also working with the US trying to improve your nuclear sharing and so on within NATO? So it's quite difficult to do both at the same time. And I think I don't have, I mean, I've been thinking about this issue and I don't have any solutions, but you can really argue both ways that the priority is really to keep Americans in and don't make any mistake by spending or wasting resources elsewhere. And on the other hand, you could argue the other way. So that was one element. And I think I had something else, but I forgot. Yes, maybe the last one would be just, but it's not just France related or UK related. It's more about, does extended deterrence, can it eventually work? Like, is there any, and it's something that's been debated for years. And so that's why I think it's interesting. You can find a lot of material during the Cold War, and the argument was always the same. Would anybody trade off Frankfurt for New York or wherever, Riga for Paris? Can any leader decide, is it even ethical to say, I'm going to defend other countries, and it means that my own citizens are going to be killed, and be killed, being very, very killed for the case of France. I mean, US, you could hope that it could survive, but in the case of France, we know that if Russia strikes us, that's the end. There's no way to recover. So is it credible? Can anybody actually believe that any French president would take the risk? Is it ethical to actually do it? And so on and so forth. And is it, yeah, I think that there's a little bit theoretical debating to do on this issue.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming on here and talking to us. I hope that the students learned a lot from this. Do you have any parting words you want to say, or anything like that?
No, I think it's interesting because it's a topic that is ongoing. I mean, it's moving as we speak. We're saying the declaration by with the UK is fresh off the press. So things are moving. They are moving faster than I ever expected. They're still moving very slowly, but faster than we ever thought, because it's I was saying a topic which is so um, very careful, very cautious. That our leadership has always been extremely prudent on keeping the doctrine, referring to the old wise men from the 60s and so on. And now we see opportunities or debates that we've not seen for a long time or expected to see. And I think the coming months and years we're gonna see where it goes, and how countries decide to resolve a little bit this tension I was saying between working within NATO. We had the summit last week, which was a couple of weeks ago, which went quite well. There's this commitment to rise expenses, but also preparing for the uncertainties of tomorrow. So quite an interesting issue to look at.
That summit, I have to say, made me feel quite a bit better about America's commitment to Europe. I was happy that when push comes to shove, there was a bit more of like a real dialogue that wasn't just like Trump yelling on a stand that like Europeans need to spend more money. I was pleasantly surprised a bit, I will say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so deep, to be honest. But and NATO, when you go and visit NATO, you realize that it's a city. It's a city in the city. It's working at so many levels. You have so many committees and groups and people working together, organizing, planning, and so on. This cannot disappear in a fortnight. What, however, can be withdrawn very quickly is the confidence you have that, once again, Trump would actually decide to go, because it's actually him deciding at the end of the day. And so there is once again this discrepancy between the relationship is or the work, the transatlantic work is going as strong as ever. It's very deep. It's at every level. There are cooperations at many technological, military, whatever. But of course, the confidence has to rely to be put on the leader for this type of issues. And so that's where you've had different reactions, and I think we've not seen the end of it.
Well, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on. I will say one comment you said where you were like, people, the far right in France has been recontextualized by looking at the far right in America. Doesn't make me feel great, but we will continue dialogue like this, and hopefully that helps, right? So thank you
Absolutely.
so much for making this less abstract for us. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you
With
so
pleasure.
much.
With pleasure, and always I remain at your disposition if you have any other questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna stop the recording now, and I hope you all have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye, Chad.
Goodbye.